All right, well, welcome everyone to an evening with Hank Meyer and Arthur Vandenberg. I'm Kevin Dundalk. I'm the director of the Henry Institute here at Calvin College. I feel like this is reverbing a little bit. Can you hear me okay? All right. I'm the director of the Henry Institute. The Henry Institute is a research institute and civic engagement center here at Calvin. And we do a lot of work on the two things you're not supposed to talk about, like company, religion, and politics. And we might get into that a little bit tonight. We have the pleasure tonight to welcome our speaker, Hendrik, aka Hank Meyer, to Calvin. Mr. Meyer started his career as a reporter and editor, which I suspect has something to do with his interest in our subject tonight. Later, he joined a certain local family business in the area. Some of you may have encountered it, Meyer Incorporated, where he is executive chairman. For many years, he has been a leader in business and philanthropy in the region in ways that are both wide and deep. But somehow in the midst of that work, he developed a voice in biography. He authored a profile of his grandfather and namesake, Thrifty Years, The Life of Hendrik Meyer, published in 1984. He has also produced a documentary on Senator Arthur Vandenberg, which first aired in 2011. He turned that longtime interest in the Michigan senator into a book, Arthur Vandenberg, The Man in the Middle of the Century, which is the springboard for our discussion tonight. And by the way, that book will also be available for purchase and for signing at the end of our evening together. About that discussion that we're about to have, first Mr. Meyer will talk to us about the life and legacy of Senator Vandenberg. Then I'm going to take a little prerogative to have a brief conversation, and then we will open the floor to questions. So would you please join me in welcoming Hank Meyer.
Thank you, Kevin, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and patient friends and family. And I say family, my wife Liesl couldn't be here tonight, but my mom Lena and daughter Hannah are, and they are both, they have both lived with this for so long. Hannah will remind me that I started on this about the time she was born, and she's, anyway. But the title for this evening is The Legacies of Arthur Vandenberg, and I thought it might be appropriate to start with the most visible of, the most visible of the senator's legacies, his influence on a certain congressman from the southeast side of Grand Rapids. The senator was becoming a world figure in 1946 when he met a young lawyer just out of the Navy. Vandenberg was back in town only briefly, stopping by his office at the Pantland Hotel. He'd just come from one of the peace conferences in Paris, and Gerald Ford was hanging out his shingle with a local law firm. And Gerald Ford was also the fresh face of the Homefront movement, which some of you may not have heard of, but it included his father, and it was a group of citizens who were challenging the corrupt Republican political machine of Frank McKay. 2 years later, in 1948, Vandenberg was fuming over the refusal of his own hometown congressman, a neighbor down the street on Morris Avenue, to support his efforts to win approval of the Marshall Plan and other post-war legislation. He was eager to see that incumbent Art Yonkman challenged. Yonkman was also a McKay man. So when Jerry Ford paid a call on the senator, Vandenberg was receptive to the young lawyer's ambitions, and he let it be known that he was backing Jerry Ford. But this Cliff Notes version of our story starts a little bit earlier. At the beginning of the 20th century, as a matter of fact, when a teenager just out of Grand Rapids Central High School fell under the sway of the most exciting politician of 100 years ago, Theodore Roosevelt. Now, young Arthur was something of a prodigy in government studies. He claimed he'd been reading the congressional records since he was 14. I've done a lot of research. I can't verify that, but that was his claim. But his first job out of school after he graduated was working at a biscuit factory downtown. And he was fired the day he left his desk to join a parade for Teddy Roosevelt, who was then the young governor of New York. He'd come to town in the fall of 1900, campaigning as a Republican candidate for vice president on the ticket with William McKinley. So young Van was both fired and inspired because he walked down the street after he lost that job and he got a job as a reporter for the Grand Rapids Herald. His first byline was a story on the Electoral College, and he was a regular Republican even as a kid. In fact, when his father died, he said, "Son, I have no facts for this, but it may have proved true as well as apocryphal." His father said, "Son, promise me you'll always be a Republican." And that was a time when the city, the state, even the country were all mostly Republican. And impossibly soon, just before he became 22 years old, he became editor of the Republican paper, the Herald, owned by Senator William Alden Smith. And this is young editor Vandenberg. You'll see Teddy Roosevelt's framed portrait with bunting over it, over his shoulder there. He was making a name for himself on the national stage well before he went to the Senate in 1928, when he was appointed upon the death of Woodbridge Ferris, as in Ferris State University, and then elected a few months later. He'd already written 3 books tied to his hero, Alexander Hamilton. He'd also written dozens of short stories, several of which were published, and a couple of which can be found across the street in the periodicals collection, which is a tremendous archive at the Heckman Library. He wrote speeches as well, for this is the cover of one of his books, Trail of a Tradition. It says, "Nationalism, not internationalism, is the indispensable bulwark of American independence," which he came to have a slightly evolved view of that over time. He wrote speeches for presidential candidate Warren Harding. He fought for reservations to Senate approval of American membership after World War I in the new League of Nations. And then he tried to find a compromise between supporters in the Senate of Woodrow Wilson, who refused to make any changes to the League of Nations covenant that he'd negotiated at the Palace of Versailles in Paris, and Wilson's opponents, led by the Republican chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Henry Cabot Lodge. And Vandenberg, as a young editor, is writing most of the editorials for the Herald, sending them out both to try to impress and to influence political figures. And he's communicating with Lodge right along, and Lodge writes back to him and says, "I'm going to steal your line. Unshared idealism is a menace." And so here you got a young editor in Grand Rapids who's already actually playing a part in the biggest foreign policy decision of the age. After World War I, do we join this new League of Nations or not? So high expectations awaited Vandenberg when he arrived in the Senate in 1928. He was eager to work with the new president, Herbert Hoover, but Hoover, who'd never held elective office, lacked finesse, to say the least, in working with Congress. And when the stock market crashed in 1929, it pretty well doomed his presidency. And then Vandenberg tries to work with Franklin Roosevelt as well, after Roosevelt's landslide victory in 1932. He's a savvy politician at this point in a state that's beginning to be a little less Republican. And he's also ready in a time of national emergency to cooperate with the Democratic administration. So he supports a lot of the New Deal remedies for a crippled economy. And he has an idea of his own, savings deposit insurance to protect small depositors and save the nation's banks. Hoover had fought him on this soon after the stock market crashed, and then Roosevelt does too. But Vandenberg has the votes in the Senate, and a new law creates the FDIC. Now, Roosevelt came to see the value of it finally, and much to Vandenberg's chagrin, he was all too happy to claim credit for what may have been the most successful piece of New Deal legislation, but it was the brainchild of Arthur Vandenberg. As the reach of federal power grew with Roosevelt, however, Vandenberg tried to draw a good Republican distinction between being social-minded and socialistic. He broke with Roosevelt over executive rulemaking that he regarded as too intrusive, and he was a real vigilante when he thought the New Deal was overstepping the Constitution. Nor could he abide Roosevelt's attempts to tinker with the Supreme Court because it had rejected some of his laws. The hardening of Vandenberg's opposition to FDR was coinciding with world events that posed new dangers. The rise of Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy threatened peace in Europe, and the Japanese War Cabinet ordered an invasion of China. In the face of threats around the globe, Vandenberg fell back on what was for him a first principle, that Hamiltonian tradition: American neutrality, no entangling alliances with other countries. In September 1939, however, debates about neutrality took on new urgency when German bombers filled the skies over Warsaw and German tanks rolled into Poland. The war had begun. And Arthur Vandenberg, on a national radio hookup broadcast from a baseball field about 8 blocks from here in East Grand Rapids at the old Ramona Park, declared, "This is not our war." And before it became our war with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, he led the band of isolationists, mostly Republican, but Democrats too, who fought Roosevelt every step of the way. They distrusted his every move, fearing that American boys would be pulled into combat. The isolationists fought and lost a fight to keep the arms embargo of the 1937 Neutrality Act that Vandenberg had helped create. They fought and lost a fight over the Lend-Lease deal, giving destroyers to the British Navy. Roosevelt was their nemesis, and Vandenberg was their organizing spirit. In 1936, he had avoided Kansas Governor Alf Landon's attempt to draft him as his running mate. Smart move. FDR carried every state except Maine and Vermont. And in the run-up to 1940, he was viewed as a leading candidate for the Republican presidential nomination. In fact, in 1938, the FBI opened an office in Grand Rapids. And when the agent sent here was asked about his new assignment, he confided that he'd been sent by J. Edgar Hoover to keep an eye on Arthur Vandenberg. I mean, think about it. Why else does the FBI open an office in Grand Rapids in 1938? But Vandenberg and his isolationist colleague Robert Taft were swept aside in 1940, along with their traditional isolationist point of view, by a charismatic lawyer, Wendell Willkie, whose willingness to intervene in Europe nearly matched Roosevelt. And here is Vandenberg on the right with Robert Taft on the left and Willkie in the middle. And the attack on Pearl Harbor made Vandenberg's traditional view look pretty obsolete, and America was soon all in a global war. As the war began to turn in favor of the Allies, who were dubbed by Franklin Roosevelt the United Nations, Republicans faced 2 big questions. One was partisan. Willkie was what might today be called a rhino. He had no party base and was viewed by most of the GOP regulars as an opportunistic interloper. Any comparisons with the present day will start to get a bit confusing, of course. But his nomination reflected a deep schism in the party, one that is still with us today, between isolationists or unilateralists who want to not do organized, cooperative things as much in the world, and internationalists who believe in broader global cooperation. And the Republicans figured if they were going to have a chance to win the presidency in 1944, these factions needed to come together. But how? The other question was on the minds of Americans of all political stripes. What would the world look like after the war, and what role should the United States play in it? Would the U.S. retreat again, as it did after World War I? Back then, Vandenberg's editorials faulted Wilson and the League of Nations. Now the question was whether and how nations might organize themselves to avoid future catastrophes. And Vandenberg, Roosevelt, Truman, they were all of approximately the same age, same generation, and they were all haunted by the memories of how the peace after World War I had been unjust and had laid the seeds for future conflict. But when it came to what the world would look like, Roosevelt wasn't saying, and he wasn't letting Democrats in Congress tackle the subject either. When they tried to introduce resolutions in the House or the Senate, he quashed them. He didn't want to rock the boat. He was focused on winning the war and didn't want to risk alienating our allies, talking about what the world would look like after the war, when British colonies are angling for independence, when the Soviet Union has very different ideas about what security will look like and who's going to rule the countries of Eastern Europe. So he was also kind of a one-man band in foreign policy. He would send his confidant, Harry Hopkins, over to meet with Stalin and basically to bypass the State Department. So his focus on winning the war and his manner of handling foreign policy in the executive branch really didn't answer any questions for anybody, and he wanted to keep the lid on that debate. So to answer that first partisan question about Republican unity, the Republican Party called a meeting of their leading elected officials to be held at the Grand Hotel on Mackinac Island over Labor Day weekend in 1943. And for those of you who've been to the Grand or been to Mackinac, that's a familiar scene on the porch. Vandenberg was chosen to chair their foreign policy group. Not for the first time. He looked for a middle way, in this case between the isolationists who wanted nothing more than to wash their hands of the world and bring the troops home after the war. These were Van's longtime friends and allies, and the Wilkie adherents who held varying ideas about world federalism, an international police force, a revived League of Nations. They met in what was called the Casino at the Grand, and that's Vandenberg, and to his left is Taft, and further left is, to our right is California Governor Earl Warren. And Republicans came out of that meeting with a statement they could run on, and an expression of support for some sort of world organization that went beyond anything that Roosevelt or the Democrats had been able to talk about or offer. And the wonderfully ambiguous, grandly named Mackinac Charter set the stage for things to come. When I succeeded in putting 49 prima donnas together, Vandenberg told Henry Luce of Time magazine, and it certainly took one to know one, I discovered the necessary formula. And for Vandenberg, compromise was really an art form. He was moving away from isolationism. Pearl Harbor had certainly played a part. We were no longer safe behind our oceans. So did his nephew, Hoyt Vandenberg, who was an Air Force general, a student of modern warfare who'd been in London during the Battle of Britain and who would drop by his uncle's apartment on a Sunday afternoon to talk strategy in the kitchen. And then there was Vandenberg's mistress, probably planted by British intelligence, but she probably had much less influence. By contrast, he relished the fawning press response to the Mackinac Charter and the GOP taking the lead in advancing support for what would become the United Nations. Still, even as he was beginning to move in a new direction, it was chiefly behind the scenes. Most of the public still thought of him as the voice of isolationism. And that changed on January 10th, 1945. The Allies were winning the war, closing in on Japan, island by bloody island, pushing across the Rhine into Germany. A weary Roosevelt, in poorer health than anyone knew, was about to leave for the Russian resort of Yalta on the Black Sea to meet with Stalin and Churchill to talk about what to do as the collapse of the Third Reich approached. And Vandenberg was worried. Neither he nor his colleagues knew what the three leaders would be deciding or what deals FDR might commit to on our behalf. So Vandenberg rose in the Senate with a proposal, a post-war security treaty among the victorious Allies to ensure that Germany would never again wage war on its neighbors. Boom. This was the leading isolationist calling for an American commitment to an entangling alliance with countries that had fought 2 world wars in the last 3 decades. It was, one correspondent said, the speech heard round the world. And it was a renunciation of beliefs he had espoused for 25 years. Now, Roosevelt, who had some bitter disputes with Vandenberg in the latter years of the New Deal, spoke dismissively about the speech, but the White House made a hasty request for 50 copies before the president departed for Yalta. And within months, the world and Vandenberg's place in it changed very quickly. Roosevelt returned from Yalta knowing that he had no choice if he was to avoid Woodrow Wilson's fatal mistake with the League of Nations after World War I, other than to appoint Vandenberg, the Republican voice on foreign policy, as a delegate to the conference to be convened in May 1945 in San Francisco to create the United Nations. And then Franklin Roosevelt died. Vice President Harry Truman had had one lunch with the president, He was a neophyte in foreign affairs, although a decisive one, because he quickly announced that the UN meeting would move ahead. Since Roosevelt had often worked around the State Department in crafting foreign policy, his new young Secretary of State, Edward Stettinius, was also sort of a marginal player, and Vandenberg's fellow delegate and counterpart in the UN delegation was Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Senator Tom Connally of Texas, and he was a canny old politician, but of limited range also. So that left Vandenberg, the Republican who had come to speak out first in favor of a world organization, to emerge as the most influential American delegate. And this is the penthouse of the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco, where the Americans, and Vandenberg's in the middle here on the left side, and the British, the Russians, and the Chinese, and the French are in the background somewhere. The great powers were meeting in what would become a forerunner of the Security Council, and they really called the shots at the UN gathering. When it came time to sit down with the other powers to design what Vandenberg liked to call the town meeting of the world, his opinion and that of the Soviet Foreign Secretary Molotov seemed to be the ones that counted most. He made sure the UN Charter allowed for regional security arrangements so that with the Monroe Doctrine, the US and its Latin American neighbors could have a mutual defense treaty. He made sure there would be enough Republicans on board in the Senate to approve the charter when it landed in their laps. And here he is signing the UN Charter with President Truman on the left there looking on. President Truman needed him. After the charter was ratified, the president asked Vandenberg and Connally to play an unprecedented role in diplomacy. Senators have never done this before to this extent. For starters, they were appointed as American delegates to the first UN General Assembly, which was held in London later in the year. And this is Connally on the right, Vandenberg on the left, Stettinius second from the right, and Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the other American delegate. And Eleanor and Arthur had a really tricky relationship because she resented his attacks on her husband, and she, of course, was generally regarded as politically to the left of her husband, and so Vandenberg and the Republicans were always suspicious of Eleanor. And one of her pet projects during the latter part of the New Deal, were developing some planned communities, and one in West Virginia called Arthurdale had as its cottage industry the making of furniture. So you can imagine you're the senator from Grand Rapids and you've got a federal project that Eleanor Roosevelt is pushing to build furniture. This didn't go over well at all. But that was just a sampling of their relationship. But after they sailed to England and served together, they went from bitter enemies to, again, these odd political bedfellows, to admirers of one another. And in fact, Vandenberg said, I take back everything I ever said about her, and it's been plenty. And then later on, when he said, you know, when she and Truman wanted him to continue on as a UN delegate, this was before there was an ambassador to the United Nations and the country had a delegation, she pleaded with him to continue on. And he said, no, you really got to get back to the Senate. I can't keep doing this. But remarkable how their relationship evolved. And more significantly even than this UN meeting, they joined the new Secretary of State successor to Stettinius, James Burns, for conferences with foreign ministers in Paris through much of 1946 to negotiate peace treaties with countries such as Italy that had fought the war on the German side. 1946 was also the year that Look magazine published a profile of Vandenberg. And in that story, there's a couple of paragraphs I can't resist sharing that get at aspects of his influence. Every few months, wrote Look, several million people become grateful to Vandenberg for expressing their vague thoughts, such as, what is Russia up to? He was the master politician in his ability to be flexible and principled at the same time. And he had the credibility that went with the reformed sinner. He'd always wanted to write a biography of St. Paul, by the way, although his political conversion, was a little more drawn out. It might take and Look continued, it might take a whirling dervish to follow the pros and cons of Vandenberg's Senate votes over the past 18 years, But Vandenberg has whirled as the American people have whirled. Or as one of his fellow senators put it, Van changes his mind as often as the average American, but slightly earlier. And I think there's sort of a hint of genius in there, because that means that you're not so far out in front that you're a leader without followers, and he was certainly no visionary, but also that you're not simply part of the pack. You're slightly anticipating what people are, what the direction that things are going. And he was a big fan of Ralph Waldo Emerson, and I think would have appreciated Emerson's essay on self-reliance that says, speak what you now think in hard words, and tomorrow speak what tomorrow thinks in hard words, though it contradict everything you said today. It's not bad for a politician, but I think there's some truth in that. And that means being ready to change and willing when the time is right. And that's what Vandenberg was doing. And in doing so, bringing millions of Americans along with him to understand that America needed to exert leadership in the world that it had been unwilling to do before the Second World War. And that made a big difference when Truman asked for support of the Truman Doctrine, calling for the U.S. to help nations threatened by totalitarian, read communist subversion. And more specifically, he was supporting Truman when the president asked America to pick up the baton from the impoverished British and aid the governments of Greece and Turkey against communist pressure. And here's Vandenberg as president pro tem of the Senate, presiding as Truman delivers that Truman Doctrine speech. And it made all the difference when Secretary of State George Marshall unveiled an unprecedented aid program to help the European democracies rebuild their shattered economies. Truman had the political sense to call this the Marshall Plan, after the revered general. Marshall himself said it could have been called the Vandenberg Plan, because he reflected when it went to Congress, Van was just the whole show. And this is Marshall on the right giving testimony to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Vandenberg presiding on the left there. But rebuilding economies was not enough. There was also the power vacuum left by the war, and now being filled in Eastern Europe by the Soviet Red Army. And the war-wracked Western democracies formed a European Union, the French and the Dutch and the Belgians, for mutual defense, but it really wouldn't mean much. They were all devastated without the United States joining. And this was the big one, an entangling alliance which Van had once so adamantly resisted. He now had a Pan-American security treaty that he had gained, that he'd written the Charter of the UN to allow, and he could use that as a template. And from that crafted the Vandenberg Resolution, which allowed American entry into the new North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. And it, too, sailed through Congress like the Marshall Plan with Vandenberg's leadership. This is in Philadelphia before the 1948 convention, when he wasn't running for president. He always wanted to be president, but after 1940, when it kind of blew up in his face when the war broke out, he never campaigned hard again. Now, his ego always hoped he'd be drafted. And so he wrote an acceptance speech, but it stayed in his pocket the whole time. But this is Vandenberg and his wife Hazel on a bench in Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia. And it's just kind of fun to see all the newsmen and photographers gathered around as he arrived at the convention, wondering, is he going to run? Isn't he going to run? He was like the Hamlet of Republican politics there. But those bipartisan majorities that Marshall Plan and NATO enjoyed were his pride and joy. And they began to fray about the time he was diagnosed in 1949 with lung cancer. And after fighting fellow Republicans in the House to secure funding for NATO military aid, he was flown to Ann Arbor for an operation that removed half of his left lung. And as Mao Zedong and the communists emerged victorious in the Chinese Civil War, Vandenberg was headed back to Morris Avenue in Grand Rapids, to the house he'd built as a young editor in 1907. He would return to Washington briefly in 1950, but he was too ill to be active. And not only had his bipartisanship suffered amid recriminations over who lost China, But a young Republican senator from Wisconsin named McCarthy was fomenting fear with wild accusations of communists in the Democratic administration. And war had broken out in Korea. The bipartisan bonds were coming apart, and Vandenberg was not there to patch them up. And that brings us full circle back to Grand Rapids. As Edward R. Murrow told his radio audience the week of Van's death here in 1951, we are now divided, bitterly, hysterically. Had he lived, he would have gloried in this conflict and steadied it. And he would have been confident that at the end of the day, little men of loud voice and small faith will yield to the collective judgment of the American people. Thank you.
All right. Well, that's great. It's important, and it's so interesting to me how timely this is. That rationale is for speaking to time.
The week I turned in the final draft for the book was let's see, it was just after was it just before or just after the election? It felt like, so this is a year ago, it felt like everything was suddenly outmoded and that I was writing about a time that we'll never enjoy again. And then all of a sudden it feels very present
Right.
when you mention this.
Yeah, no doubt. And so I want to return to how it may be present, but something else you just said, it piqued my interest, and it has to do with, you were suggesting, so Vandenberg wasn't especially visionary, highly strategic in lots of ways, but also slightly ahead of his time, always slightly ahead of the public, slightly ahead of opinion.
Well, before the war, he was slightly behind. Opinion was changing, and that's why Wendell Willkie got the nomination and he didn't.
Although, of course, he was trying to move opinion.
Yes, absolutely.
As a journalist, as a writer. Right. And that's actually what I wanted to ask about. Just going back to the beginning, he kind of skyrockets into this journalistic career and a writing career, more generally. I mean, what kind of influence did that have on his leadership, just the way he looked at his life as a leader? Did it help him have his finger on a pulse so that he could stay slightly ahead of opinion? Is that part of it, or?
I think it gave him maybe a sense of responsibility that he had a role to play, and he realized he could play it. And from a local angle, there was a Republican Party treasurer, a coal magnate from Chicago named George Getz, and some of you may know Lakewood Farm in Holland, but that was George Getz's place, and he had a big house and several cottages, and he would invite Republican friends and office holders to come out there in the summer and stay in those cottages for a couple of weeks. And that's where Vandenberg met Will Hayes, later the Hayes Commission of Motion Picture Censorship fame, but back then the chairman of the Republican National Committee. And so when Harding gets nominated, Hayes calls up Vandenberg and says, hey, will you come? I need you to write speeches. And so from that early stage, he's sort of invited into the leadership circles. And I often think one of Vandenberg's books was called The Greatest American, and it was his argument for why Alexander Hamilton was the greatest American, but he polled all these other leaders from Franklin Roosevelt to Winston Churchill and said, who do you think's the greatest American? And some said Washington, and some said Lincoln, and some Ben Franklin or other ideas. But he was writing that during the Harding administration when, by generally accepted opinion, you had one of the most mediocre political groups of all time, and Vandenberg was reaching back to say, there's something more here we need to rediscover.
Yeah. Actually, I wanted to ask about those heroes that he had. So Hamilton being one of them, Roosevelt in his own time being another, Teddy Roosevelt.
I think Teddy Roosevelt was a little like John F. Kennedy must have been for people in 1960. You were pulled, you were drawn into the idea of public service by that charismatic figure.
Yeah, you're willing to get fired over it. And then in MacArthur, later on, I noticed, that he gets behind MacArthur. But it was interesting because I read the book as partly this story of a political conversion, but also partly about a man who is serving in the legislative branch. Now, I'm a political scientist, so this may be a question that only a political scientist could love. Which means that there may be two people in this room, Michael Leroy and me, who might like this.
And I'm not, so Michael probably has a better answer.
But it, you can read the book really as this reflection on, or a way in which Vandenberg is trying to protect the prerogatives of the legislative branch. Quite often I was reading it, okay, yeah, he's making this isolationist kind of non-interventionist argument. But it's partly related to the fact that he wants to protect the prerogatives of Congress to make these decisions. And he's worried that these energetic executives and the executive presidents are out of line. But then I think about his heroes, Hamilton, who believed in an energetic executive to the point that, bring on Washington and let him stay, right? Or Roosevelt, right? Or MacArthur. These heroes, and I was wondering how do you square this fact that his heroes seem to be, sort of the models of energetic executives?
Great question. I'm not sure how to bring Hamilton into that. I think in the case of Teddy Roosevelt, he and Woodrow Wilson were both more assertive presidents than any of their predecessors, but they didn't transform the executive role in the way that Franklin Roosevelt did.
Right.
And I think that was really when the rubber hit the road in terms of, wow, this is the whole, and I think you can make the very legitimate argument that Roosevelt was remaking the economy to save capitalism.
Yeah.
But of course, from Vandenberg's perspective, as so many other Republicans, the things he were doing were such wholesale changes that they were threatening the established order in a way that I don't think Roosevelt or Wilson did to the same degree.
I see. So he could imagine that Congress still had its prerogatives pre-Franklin Roosevelt.
Right.
Even though these were energetic executives in like
there was always there was a Taft after Roosevelt and a Harding after
right.
Wilson
right.
after Teddy Roosevelt, but Franklin just seemed to be there forever, consolidating power in the executive branch.
I see. So, thinking about Hamilton again. Hamilton had this very nationalistic, and many founders, of course, had this idea that we need to protect ourselves from foreign entanglements and so forth. And Vandenberg goes through this conversion. Do you think after he goes through the conversion that he's still a Hamiltonian? I mean, how would he still think of himself that way?
Well, part of his attraction to Hamilton was not only on that front. He related to Hamilton because his father's harness business went bust when he was 9, and so he had to go to work at a very young age. And he identified with the young clerk. I mean,
sure.
Vandenberg was in the hinterlands, but not as distant as the Caribbean, but still the young clerk making his way.
Right.
I think clearly closer to his mother as Hamilton was. Hamilton was a romantic figure for him in a lot of ways that may have gone beyond just the policy stuff. But Hamilton also was an opponent of slavery. He was part of that development of the northern states, and Vandenberg liked the protective tariff, the things that nurtured incubated the early stages of the Republic. That all appealed to him as well. So it's hard to pull out a single strand to say he was a strict adherent.
Yeah. Well, I can keep asking questions. I just want to ask a couple of others, though, and then we'll open it up. And this is switching gears a little bit. But we had talked earlier, one question I have that doesn't come out necessarily as clearly in the book, and maybe it's because there's not much of a story to tell, but it's a question about religion. So here we are at Calvin College. I direct an institute. You can guess I'd want to ask these questions. So I'm just wondering, to what extent did religious faith matter to him? Did it shape the way he quotes the Bible liberally, right? And so he's willing to use it in a sense strategically, right? But does it shape the way he's looking at the world at all? Does it have that kind of effect, deeper effect?
It's hard to tell that. He was very learned in the Bible. In fact, I have his concordance that he kept on his desk as
one of 3 books, right, that he had at his desk. A thesaurus, a dictionary, and the concordance.
Yes, so that was very close to him. He was a lifelong Congregationalist. very devoted to Park Church, and that was his parents, particularly, again, his father died when he was younger, but his mother's church for her entire life. I know his daughter was worried that as he was dying, his friend Claire Booth Luce might be trying to convert him to Catholicism. He never bid at that, but he talked about having a little prayer meeting with himself every night. So I'm jumping around because I don't find a sort of unifying thread in that sense. His wife Hazel was Presbyterian, and he and she talked about going to New York Presbyterian Church in Washington when he was first elected. The story that always comes back to me is that of the Senate chaplain Peter Marshall. For those of you who know who a man called Peter, as a young Scottish immigrant Presbyterian preacher, became chaplain of the Senate. When Vandenberg was president pro tem, with no vice president, he occupied the vice president's office off the Senate floor, and each day for about 2 years before Marshall died quite young, when Vandenberg was presiding, Marshall would come to his office a few minutes before the opening session. They would talk about what was going to be on the agenda that day, and Marshall would craft an opening prayer based on that. And that relationship meant a lot to Vandenberg. I think it was, in some ways it was paternal. And in some ways it was a sort of daily spiritual nourishment for him.
Right, interesting. Well, related to that, and then jumping ahead in time, one other question just about the subculture in West Michigan, which, you think about recent politics, partly related to people who really connected their faith to their political witness. But I'm wondering, as you think about West Michigan, Michigan in general perhaps, but especially West Michigan, can you draw a line, if you think about a legacy of Arthur Vandenberg, can you draw a line from him, maybe through Jerry Ford, but then into some familiar names here, especially I direct the Henry Institute, so Paul Henry, the namesake of the Institute, Vern Ehlers, Steve Monsma. Vern and Steve both passed away this year, so that's on my mind. But is there some kind of subculture of doing politics here, where Vandenberg is a lead figure, and perhaps if there is, so there's multiple questions here, I suppose. Is there a kind of distinctive witness that subculture might have to the current politics of the day?
Well, fascinating question, and you hate to generalize too much, but Vandenberg only held one elective office before he went to the Senate. He was a Grand Rapids City Charter Commissioner in 1910. In other words, he was elected as one of several citizens to draw up a city charter. That city charter called for a council manager form of government. It was one of the first in the country, and it was nonpartisan. And so I mean, can you make a weird argument that West Michigan political tradition is this combination of Republican nonpartisan in a way? I mean, Republicans with a sympathy or an appreciation of a nonpartisan approach to governing, which maybe becomes bipartisan. And you think of Vandenberg working with Democrats on a bipartisan basis, and you think of Paul Henry's friendship with Ted Kennedy and the kind of bonds that he had across the aisle. If there's a connection, I think, and Jerry Ford certainly in between, I think you can find some commonalities there, not that you don't see it in other places in the country, but I think we've got a thread there, and so that says, hey, Steve Monsma being a little bit of an outlier here because he was a Democrat, of course, but that we're Republicans, but we come from a place where nonpartisanship also works pretty darn well, and so we can default to working across party lines because of that.
So it's interesting. You would point to a structure that was put in place at one point in time.
A willingness to think in nonpartisan terms, even as you've got your partisan prejudices on a larger stage.
But he also, Vandenberg, also left this legacy of a particular way of, I would say, thinking about politics. You ended by saying, kind of glorying, forget exactly the quote, but glorying in the conflict, but also steadying it.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
he loved to get up in the Senate and deliver a
Right.
stem-winding speech,
Right.
but the idea that ultimately the result is to find a common ground.
Right. I mean, he feared extremes.
Right.
He feared populism for that
populism was, I mean, William Jennings Bryan, of course, was the big populist of his youth,
Right.
and he liked the fact that William Jennings Bryan was also, as a Democrat, opposed to foreign intervention, and so resigned, of course,
Sure.
as Wilson Secretary of War on the eve of World War I. But they could agree only on that. Otherwise, this idea that that this is a republic in
Right.
its pure sense was
Right.
always important to him.
Yeah. Okay, well, I have one other question, and this would seem like an unfair question, except that it's the question that probably your publisher put on the dust jacket. It's at the end, and so could you name a Vandenberg of today?
No, for a couple of reasons. Well,
Yeah.
first of
Yeah.
all, the Senate doesn't have the stature today
Right.
that it did.
Right.
I think the Senate reached this is in the 1930s and 40s, a lot of senators were still household words. And then when Vandenberg to some degree or Huey Long or other senators stood up in the Senate, it was big national news. I mean, now it's only news if there's something scandalous going on, it seems. But senators, the legislative branch, and again, Franklin Roosevelt was the first big factor here in that notion of an imperial presidency
Right.
that has since gained a lot more traction. So senators had more stature,
Right.
particularly if you chaired a committee. I mean, in Vandenberg's time, Taft later became minority leader, but Taft and Vandenberg were running the Senate, and neither one was the minority leader. We don't even remember who the minority leader
Right.
was. It was Warren, Wallace White or somebody.
Yeah.
So if you chaired a committee and in the Senate, you were a really powerful figure
Right.
in your own right. And that stature doesn't exist to that degree today. And then, of course, in the current climate, you need someone in the executive branch with whom you can negotiate.
Right.
And that reciprocity
Right.
doesn't seem to exist
Yeah.
at the moment.
There were certainly tensions.
Oh,
right,
yes,
at that
of course.
time.
Yeah.
But the reciprocity is something that has to be learned, and maybe there just aren't those opportunities for learning it. I noticed in the book how often in that period of time people were entertaining each other.
Oh, yes.
Just every night they were entertaining each other, and they just went through a cycle. The Senate.
Oh, it was
homes,
a
and then
ritual. Yeah.
Just ritualistically, there was interaction. There was today we'd say networking going
Yeah, well,
on.
it had
but was
nothing. It
across-
had nothing to do with party. It all
Right.
had to do with role in the government. But the great pressure, and of course, in most cases, it was wives, the spouses of the senators or the congressmen. They had one day a week when you went to other senators' homes,
Yeah.
and another day of the week where you went to cabinet members, and another day of the week where you went to congressmen, another day of the week where you went to the diplomatic corps,
Yeah.
and you made your rounds. And of course, and in Vandenberg's case, they lived in the Wardman Park Apartments on Connecticut Avenue, which was this nice apartment tower, one of the first in D.C. And Henry Wallace, the Secretary of Agriculture,
Right.
that Vandenberg argued with all the time, lived in the building. I mean, Vandenberg complained humorously that he almost took his head off once with a boomerang when he was showing Arthur how he used a boomerang, and there were other cabinet members and Supreme Court justices. They were all seeing each other on the elevator,
Right.
and again those relationships have diminished. I mean, I can in a later version of that. Debbie Dingell, who's now a congresswoman in Southeast Michigan, talked about her husband John. When John went through his divorce, Jerry and Betty Ford would have him over for dinner as a fellow congressman.
Right.
And yeah, those relationships are hard to find as the congressmen are all on their planes back to their districts every
Right.
Thursday night.
Exactly. And those are exactly the sorts of things that generated reciprocity.
Yeah.
Right?
And so Paul
You
Henry
learned
must
that.
have been on that, where that was, in
Yeah.
serving at the time that was
So
changing.
he passed away in '93. So he passed away just before the Republicans took over in the '94 elections. So those were waning days in
Right.
in a lot of ways of those that kind of learning of reciprocity. It's interesting. Well, let me open it up to questions. Surely there are some. Go ahead.
I'm curious about a parallel story going on in the rising chance of power popularity, and that is the development and proliferation of nuclear warfare. And I wondered where he was in that whole development, was he part of development, was he pro-nuclear, or was he on
Great question, because of course nobody knew the atomic bomb. I mean, that was such a well-guarded secret, and Truman famously didn't know about the existence of the bomb until after he became president. And but once we had the bomb, Vandenberg was one of the organizers of the original. There was a joint House-Senate Committee on Atomic Energy, and he was one of the people who proposed that and organized that. Made an early trip to Oak Ridge to try to understand the physics of it, and there were big debates at that time. One was over should there be military or civilian control, and he was ambivalent, but ultimately came down on the side of civilian control. But there were also scientists who thought this knowledge should be shared, so that we can, if everybody has access to the bomb, then somehow they're going to get it anyway, was the logic, and let's share it now and argue for restrictions on atomic development. And he was not in favor of sharing that. He said, this is our strategic advantage, and there's more risks than benefits from sharing. And then when the Soviets exploded their bomb in September of 1949, it was after his surgery was scheduled in Ann Arbor, but just before he had left Washington. And he writes to his wife Hazel and says, his best friend was also his personal doctor back here in Grand Rapids, a guy named A.B. Smith. And he writes to Hazel and he says, would you ask A.B. if I really need to come back for the surgery yet, because I'm really needed in Washington, because everybody was at Twitter because of the bomb. The Russians now had the bomb, and that was changing the landscape, as you could imagine. His ego was sort of hoping that he'd be so important that he couldn't be spared and have to go for the surgery. But no, Smith said, no, you need the surgery. You've postponed it long enough. But that was the span in which he dealt with the bomb. He, again, to your point on legislative prerogative, very much wanted congressional oversight, and that this shouldn't be just, the military ought to have a say in this, but it ought not to be an executive military question. The Congress needs to provide oversight. And then the first director of the Atomic Energy Commission was a New Deal Democrat named David Lilienthal, who had run the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was, of course, one of Roosevelt's grandest New Deal projects. And he was attacked in the Senate by some Republicans for being too much of a leftist. And Vandenberg said, no, this guy's a really capable administrator, and he's going to do a good job, and this is an important responsibility we're entrusting him with to develop American energy policy. And so Vandenberg provided crucial support for Lilienthal, even though Lilienthal was a Democrat that he would have opposed in other respects.
Jonathan?
appropriately we focus tonight on Vandenberg's foreign relations sector. So you started tonight telling us about the FDIC. Number one, where did that come from, that domestic policy concern? Where did that come from? And number two, was he at all engaged in other domestic issues that perhaps were never as tall and well known as his international work? Were there others?
The FDIC started when the stock, in the wake of the stock market crash, the first big banking crisis was in Detroit. And so this is back, Hoover's still president. This is in 1932, before and after Hoover's elected, before and after Roosevelt's elected, but before Roosevelt takes office. And Vandenberg is huddling with James Couzens, the other senator from Michigan, and Hoover's Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, and they are trying to figure out what to do about the imminent collapse of there were bank holding companies, and there were two of them in Detroit, and both of them were in trouble, and if they went down, all the banks in Detroit would go down. And convoluted negotiations with Henry Ford, because Henry Ford's son Edsel was on the board of one of the banks and had put some additional capital in, but there was going to be a run on the bank unless they could get more capital. And Couzens, who used to run Ford for Ford, who was very wealthy in his own right, was willing to put a little bit of money in, but only if Henry Ford would put some more money into the bank, to the holding company. And Henry Ford said, no, let him fail. I'm not going to put any more in. And so the Washingtonians are dispatching emissaries to Dearborn to try to persuade Ford to come in. And meanwhile, they're trying to develop a mechanism in Washington to help the banks. And when Roosevelt comes in, he declares a bank holiday, and they shut the banks temporarily, and then extend some loans to reopen them. But Vandenberg had lived through that, had been in the middle of that crisis in Detroit, and seen the panic that was about to set in Detroit. And so he'd always been sort of generally in favor as an editorial writer of deposit insurance, but that moment crystallized it for him. And so when Roosevelt came in, and he proposed it to Hoover before Roosevelt came in, but Hoover was skeptical about it, and Roosevelt wasn't going to touch it and didn't want to do any involvement in the banking situation until he took office, because he didn't want to get dragged into Hoover's mess. And so then when Roosevelt comes in, he's opposed to it. Now, he is the governor of New York with close ties to Wall Street, and I don't say that in any sinister way, but in the sense of his familiarity with banks is with the big New York banks, who weren't really sure that they wanted to save these, to see federal money, because they were FDIC, the banks all had to kick into it, and the big New York banks weren't sure they wanted to kick in to help save banks in Michigan or Louisiana or wherever a crisis hit. And so he was kind of knee-jerk opposed to it. But Vandenberg had the votes. It was a popular bipartisan measure, and was able to and Roosevelt threatened to veto, but then ultimately didn't veto it and came to love it. Other things, as Vandenberg got more powerful, he and Taft really divided responsibilities on the Republican side of the Senate, or when they were briefly in the majority in running the Senate. And Taft generally deferred to Vandenberg on foreign policy. Sometimes they had to argue about the size of aid for the Marshall Plan or something, but Vandenberg generally deferred to Taft on domestic policy. Now, that inherently was sometimes more conservative than Vandenberg would have been, because that meant that sometimes the Republican minority is working with those encrusted Southern Committee Chairman Democrats who have a very conservative agenda. Vandenberg's last vote in the Senate, however, in 1950, when he briefly went back to Washington in the Senate after his surgery and before he came back here and died, was on the Fair Employment Practices Act, an early piece of civil rights legislation that that the Southern Democrats were trying to kill. And let's see, and this is, you're the political scientist. He was on one side of the cloture argument to try to, and voted unsuccessfully against the invoking cloture by the Southerners. And I think that was something that his grandfather had been a Lincoln delegate to the 1860 convention and had been an abolitionist, and I think that was always a part of his tradition as well.
But Vandenberg really cut his political teeth in the progressive kind of movement. I mean, that's the interesting thing. In your book, this kind of tension between his progressivism and more conservative elements in the Republican Party, and that was, so that some of the dispute was intra-party,
Oh,
you know,
very much.
figuring out how to balance these interests within the party. I thought that was as much a story of, a masterful story as how he was interacting across party lines.
Well, his early nightmare was in 1912 when Teddy Roosevelt's done being president and decides not to run for re-election in 1908. His anointed successor, William Howard Taft, becomes president. But Taft is a regular Republican. He is faintly progressive, and I mean more than he's given credit for in hindsight. But he's not Roosevelt, and he gets rid of a couple of Roosevelt's cabinet members. Roosevelt misses being president, comes back in 1912. Taft, in a bitterly fought battle, wins renomination and Teddy Roosevelt splinters off and forms the Bull Moose Party and runs against him. And for Vandenberg, this is like a nightmare. You know,
Right.
This is my dear Big Tent Republican Party, and it's completely gone asunder. And you know, I love Roosevelt, but I really want the security of the party apparatus, and you know, I've given all my life to you know, this, and so I'm sticking with Taft. But you know, how do I get these guys to get together? And that was an early
Right.
partisan crisis for him.
He kept the picture up, though.
That's right.
Above his eye.
Although
above
he's
his
said to have
desk.
turned it the other way.
Oh,
for
turned
a
it
while.
the other way.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
right. Yeah, yeah, that's right. Other question, please.
I don't want to give him too much credit for being reflective. I mean, when we talk about visionary, I mean, in my mind, he was an engineer more than he was an architect, and so there's people in the State Department whose names are less well known today, but who are actually much more influential than Harry Truman in calling the shots in the world, like Dean Acheson and of course George Marshall, and they were relatively more visionary in terms of recognizing a need to do this or that great thing, but Vandenberg signing on to it, but then Vandenberg having the engineering skills, if you will, the legislative skills to figure out how to put something through. Now, to your point, I'm not sure. I mean, he would always have been a partisan, but he would have, I think, recognized the legitimacy of other views in the sense that, now how much of that was good old compromise building and how much of that was a philosophical predisposition, I'd have a hard time saying. But it's, the difference is crystallized for me. So Dean Acheson, who was Secretary of State for Harry Truman, wrote this great memoir called Present at the Creation that I think defined that post-war era in foreign policy better than anybody else has. But in doing so, he was also, I mean, he was a classic elitist, condescending toward everybody else and putting himself at the center of that creation. And so he would talk rather condescendingly of Vandenberg about how, you know, we'd come up with this great proposal at the State Department, and we'd send it over to Vandenberg. And he'd huff and puff and have to make all these changes, and we called that putting on the Vandenberg brand, and that made him feel good, and it satisfied his ego, and then he'd go and put it through Congress. And the ego was ever present, and that's certainly true, but there was also a recognition on Vandenberg's part, and not Acheson, and so if Acheson was the architect and Vandenberg was the engineer, of saying, you know what, I've got to tweak it this way to take care of this senator's concern, and tweak it this way to take care of this faction's concern. And if you want the bill to get through, we need to consider all these other viewpoints. And that's the sort of the grunt work of legislating, but he was passionate about that. And I don't know, whether it was purely deal. There was something. I mean, it seems too superficial to say it was just about deal making. There was a recognition. Well, in the Marshall Plan hearings were, I think, the most extensive ever held on any topic in Congress. And his idea basically, again, was to, in a sense, wear down the opposition by saying, we're going to listen to everybody. And, what this economist has to say or this congressman was to say, come on down and we'll listen to you. And he caught flack sometimes when he chaired foreign relations for inviting senators to join who weren't on the committee to come and attend some of the hearings and ask questions, because if he could invite them under the tent and let them feel like they were a part of it, he had a better chance of getting things approved. And so anyway, I don't have a good answer for your question, Jan, but I think that sense of well, I think he always felt, I mean, particularly since so much of his career was in opposition, he always felt like he was the countervailing argument. So I don't think he didn't expend a lot of sympathy saying, geez, if I'm running everything, do I still have to listen to him? Because he never got a chance to do that.
He certainly inherited a vision, right? Absolutely. So I keep coming back to Hamilton, but you think about this sort of small R Republican vision, right? That you're going to deliberate among a variety of factional interests, and you're going to recognize that those interests will exist, and you're going to be comfortable with the fact they're going to exist, but you recognize, yes, we must negotiate among them. So there's an inheritance of a vision.
I mean, the country, a lot of people here know better than I do, but I mean, the country owes its existence to a large extent to Hamilton and Jefferson being able to reconcile enormous philosophical and regional differences. And so I think he was imbued with that expectation.
Interesting. Yeah.
Well, you have to bear with me for this question. It started, some of us know Gordon Olson, who was city historian in Grand Rapids for many years. And I'd finished the biography of my grandfather in 1984. And in the latter stages of it, I'd been doing some research at the Grand Rapids Library. And then I've always been interested in foreign policy. And so on my own, I've been reading about, and in both places, both locally in the history of the town and then in my own reading, I'd keep running across Arthur Vandenberg. And here's this guy from Grand Rapids. And 20 years ago, if you walked down the street in Grand Rapids and said, do you know who Arthur Vandenberg is? The most common answer I would wager that you would get, and the one I got many times, was he related to the jewelry store? And no relation as far as I know, but the guy had largely disappeared. And so he died before he could write his own memoir, and he was a writer and wanted to do that. There had been a biographer whose scrapbooks are in the Bentley Library in Ann Arbor, a guy who wrote for the Grand Rapids Press named Ralph Smith, who, as a reporter, was trailing after Vandenberg, hoping to write his biography, and died and never did. And so I'm talking with Gordon about, boy, Vandenberg's really slipped into obscurity, but we were both aware that in 1970, a historian who had done his PhD at Michigan, named David Tompkins, had turned his dissertation into a book called The Evolution of a Modern Republican, Arthur Vandenberg, 1884 to 1945. And so it stopped short of the big years. But Michigan State University published that in 1970. And I assumed that the guy was working on a second volume. He'd become a professor in Chicago. And so, I remember saying to Gordon, I'm really curious about this guy Vandenberg, but there's going to be a 2-volume biography of him, and the world doesn't need 2 biographies of Arthur Vandenberg. And so Gordon, both thinking generously and selfishly, was that year chairing the program committee for the Historical Society of Michigan's annual conference. So the Historical Society of Michigan they met in Lansing for their annual conference. This is now in the fall of 1989. And Gordon Olson said, well, you don't have to write a biography of Vandenberg, but you're interested in him. And I need to fill out my program. And Historical Society of Michigan, they'll have a keynote speech, and then there'll be a dozen small group meetings on different topics. So he says, why don't you just do something on Vandenberg? So I did the debate in 1939 when war breaks out over the repeal of the Neutrality Act. And I deliver it to a room with 6 people in it, I think, were in the audience.
That is very familiar, by the way, for academics.
So I am so grateful for this crowd. And John Logie, our former mayor, was actually coincidentally one of the people in that room. And talk just, gave this little talk. That's in late October of 1989. In January of 1990, I get a call from the daughter of this professor in Chicago, who he was divorced, living alone, had a lot of health issues and personal issues. He had died, and his adult daughter, she lived in Iowa, she was coming to Chicago to take care of his estate and to sell his house in Wilmette. And she didn't know what to do with his basement full of files about his research for Arthur Vandenberg. And these were Xerox copies from the Truman Library, the Roosevelt Library, the British Foreign Office. They had no monetary value, but he'd spent years amassing them, and I'm trying to figure out, young family at home, day job, how am I, one of the daunting things to do, this is the age before the internet, was, how do you spend a week at the Truman Library and a week in Hyde Park, New York at the Roosevelt Library? All this stuff. Besides which, there's this guy working on this biography. So it goes from saying, so she doesn't know what to do with all of his research. She calls the Historical Society of Michigan, says, do you know anybody who has an interest in Arthur Vandenberg? They only knew one person, and that was the person who'd spoken at their conference on Arthur Vandenberg. So they gave her my phone number. I ended up bringing a van load of papers back from Chicago, and you go from saying the world doesn't need another biography of Arthur Vandenberg to saying, wow, if you don't do it, who's going to? And having the sense of mission that goes with suddenly having sort of inherited some of your research. And that freed me up to the primary research is his papers in Ann Arbor, and it freed me up to drive to Ann Arbor to do that, and freed me up to interview people who were still alive and remembered him, and I didn't have to spend as much time on the sort of peripheral work. I had that, and so that was a wonderful, wonderful, unexpected gift that started this long odyssey.
You should go around and give that vignette to graduate students who give presentations at conferences to 6 people. And that way they'll know there's hope. There's hope for you.
Oh, you bet.
Okay, one more question. Bill, you had a question, yeah.
I'd like to think so, but everybody involved in some degree in terms of elective office was Midwestern at that time. Other than Roosevelt, if you think about Truman, then Eisenhower, Wendell Willkie, Robert Taft, they were all Midwesterners. So I hesitate, and they all got along to some degree, but I hesitate to make too many generalities. You'd certainly like to think so. I think the Midwest occupied was in some ways more central. With so much of the population growth of the country has been on the coasts. And so California, Florida, Texas, that's where all the people live. So our electoral votes don't count as much. Our congressional delegations aren't as big proportionately as they were 60 or 70 years ago. And I think that may be a piece of it. We were in a more important position of negotiating strength, if you will. And while we were predominantly Republican, gosh, I don't know. I mean, you'd like to think as Midwesterners we want to get along with each other better. I don't know. Yeah, yeah. And there was, I mean, I could dredge up some more, but the Midwest was almost overrepresented in the elective leadership at that time.
Well, as we leave, to your left, you can buy the book. You can have the book signed just over there by the fireplace, so pleasant little spot. We have refreshments, but before then, if you could join me in thanking Hank Meyer for this presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.